Third Budget Commission meeting. I'm Katie Howard, your Budget Commission Chair. And with that, it is on. Sorry, let me start again. Hello and welcome to the October 3rd Budget Commission meeting. I'm Katie Howard, the Chair of the Budget Commission. And with that, I will ask Ms. Harrison to please call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have representing Educational District 1, our committee chair, Ms. Katie Howard.
Present.
Representing Educational District 2, Ms. Aretta Baldwin.
Present.
Representing Educational District at Large, Seat 9, Ms. Jessica Johnson.
Present.
We also have our superintendent, Dr. Brian Johnson. Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. With that, do I have a motion to approve the May 16th Well, it's okay. Budget Commission minutes?
So moved.
All in favor?
Second.
Second, pardon, I'm skipping ahead. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Great, thank you all. All right, is there a motion to approve the October 3rd Budget Commission meeting agenda? Do you have a motion?
So moved.
Do you have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. All right, so we have a lot to go over today, but before we begin, I want to set the tone because this is the first Budget Commission meeting, getting started on the 2026 budget planning. And Aretta did such a great job earlier in board development, laying out the connection between the Board of Education, the goals and guardrails, and the strategic plan, and how it connects back to the community's vision and values. And to recap, the board's job is to gather the feedback from the community on their vision and values, what they want students to know and be able to do, and what the board is about to really embark on in terms of collecting and understanding. We are going to be updating our goals and our guardrails, and then we'll work with the superintendent to update the goals and the guardrails. And then he takes that and develops the strategic plan, which should align with the budget and providing the support he needs to implement the plan and work towards achieving the goals. And that brings us to the Budget Commission's role and the board's role in the budget development process. We don't put together the budget or manage it, but we also don't just accept it as is or just as a report. It is our job to ask questions of the superintendent in order to understand the proposed budget, and right now as it's being developed, how it will best support the needs of our students and accomplish our goals and priorities. We do need to take into account that we're, in the process of resetting our goals, but thanks to Dr. Johnson's ongoing evaluation and needs assessment of the district, we will have a lot of information on which areas we need to lean into more and how. At the same time, the board will be working on getting feedback from the community to reset our goals and guardrails, and from there, Dr. Johnson will develop the strategic plan with all the input and feedback gathered and working to align the budget with our needs and priorities. With all that said, today's meeting is about understanding the realities of our system right now and where we are, including a $100 million gap in funding going into planning for the 2026 budget. Hopefully the information I've shared on budget alignment with my colleagues on the Budget Commission, which I will also be sharing with all our colleagues, so we really understand our role as a board, and making sure there's alignment between the budget and our priorities and our needs, and supporting our superintendent and what he's proposing and putting forth. All that will help us ask the right questions that lead to understanding what we need in order to ensure there's significant growth and achievement for our students, and using the most impactful lever, which is the budget, to increase student outcomes effectively. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Johnson and our CFO, Dr. Bracken. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, I will, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I will turn it almost directly over to Lisa Bracken, you all know CFO. What we have tried to do over the last several weeks is to kind of share chunks of information with the board as a whole. So a good bit of what you will see here today has been shared in different modalities throughout the course of the last month. And I also know that some of this information is, much of it is a continuation of last year's work really as well. So I think as mentioned, there is a budget gap, but there's also a real opportunity, and so I will turn it over to Lisa at this time.
Great, thank you. So yes, today we're going to dive right in with where we left off last year. So at the April board retreat where we talked about budget, you saw most of these slides. We've just dusted them off and refreshed the FY25 column, refreshed the multi-year based on where we actually landed with our FY25 budget adoption. And so we'll start with the multi-year. We'll use the multi-year to frame our budget parameter development for the FY 2026 budget cycle. And then we will talk about how we step through the decision-making process that gets us to a final adoption in June of 2025. So this is the multi-year. Some of the assumptions that are driving the multi-year is a steady growth of around 3 to 4% in local revenue. That would be much less than what we've seen in the last few years, which has ranged from 7 to even 10% in local revenue. We've built that gap in based on House Bill 581, which we'll talk about in a little bit in a minute, that would cap our ability to raise local revenue from homesteaded properties. The state, we have an assumption of steady growth, but again, as local digest increases, there's some offset in our local fair share. Our other revenue remains pretty constant, and then we have some small growth assumptions on our Title I transfer in to the general fund. Fund balance, we have a goal to become less dependent on fund balance going into FY26, with a goal to start restoring fund balance by 28 through 30. So that means that in the upcoming fiscal year, as we take a big step off of fund balance usage, we would actually see a revenue decline of about 1.6%, and then going forward, a more steady 2 to 3% increase in revenue in the out years. The expenditure assumptions, we are assuming a salary increase of around 5% each year. That is about a 3% COLA on top of a step increase. Supply costs and other costs for professional learning and professional contracted services up about 4% to 6%. For our charters and partner schools, those would be based on our local revenue and expenditure assumptions. Central office, we have those same increases that we have in the schools on those non-personnel accounts, plus a gradual less dependence on general fund for our nutrition as that program stands up. And the ERP implementation is built into this, and it would close out in FY 2028. For the district-wide, we would see a 6% increase in the district-wide benefit rates until FY 2027, when the pension would be paid off. And then state grants and utilities, we see annual scaling. This means that in the upcoming year for FY 2026, we would expect expenditures to go up by about 6%. In FY 27, it's much lower as we see that pension paid off, an increase of about 1.6%, and then back to about a 6 to 7% increase in the out years. Again, these are conservative growth estimates based on our previous year spends, which I'll show you in a minute. So even with a conservative assumption around expenditure growth, we would start the budget cycle for FY26 with about $100 million in deficit. So when you talk about us, talk about our $100 million gap. Assumptions of growth are in that, right? So it's not that we are losing $100 million of revenue. It's that if we continue to grow at a pace that is even comparable to the growth that we've had in the last year, we will see that gap. So we have to come off of that. What has got us here, a lot of that is in the salaries and benefits over the last 10 years. Salaries have increased by about 70% over that time, benefits up about 90%. Benefits are two components for the most part. There's one that is a percentage increase of salary, so as salaries increase, benefits increase. And then also state health, the rates have increased by about 60%. Other purchase services, which includes our charter and partners, is up about 292%. And the overall general fund has increased by about 114% in the last 11 years. So when I show here the expenditure increase of around 6% in the out years, historically we see growth of at the lowest around, in a growth year at the lowest around 4.3%, but up to almost 16% in some years. So you can see the growth, the angles of this chart is much more accelerated in those later years. What's driving some of that growth? I already mentioned salary and benefits. School size is a big driver. So if APS had schools with a similar student population as some of our comparison districts, we would have about 12 to 48 fewer schools. The staffing ratio, just the number of adults that we employ in our district, paying high salaries to and high benefit rates to, is about 2,600 to about 3,700 more staff than comparable districts. And then some of our structures. So we see a central office rebound after previous years of reductions. We also see that our charter system, by its nature, has some inefficiencies in it and its flexibility and economies of scale. The way that we fund our schools using the student success funding formula does increase flexibility, but also it does depend on schools having sufficient enrollment to generate enough funds to be sustainable. And currently about 67% of our schools are receiving a small school supplement. And then also looking at programs, initiatives, and other supports. And I don't know that this is our most recent presentation, because we have also added potential redundancy in some of our professional development contracts. I keep saying professional services, purchase services, contracts, and vendors. And so we would need to look at redundancy between staffing and where we are outsourcing as well. And I'll pause here if there's any questions.
Perfect. Retta?
Thank you. I do have some questions, so I appreciate the pause. So when I'm looking at slide 3, and I see the charters and partners and the growth there, I need a little bit of understanding, because the way I'm thinking is they have caps in terms of how many kids can go to the schools, and we haven't added any schools. So where is this increase, and what's driving that?
Yeah, so I can go, we will go into depth a little bit more about that in a few slides. But ultimately, it's just as charters and partners receive a share of our revenue, when revenue goes up, their total dollar amount goes up.
So that's not
It's not
attached
necessarily
to
enrollment driven.
enrollment. Okay. And so on slide 4, is that the similar case in terms of the second bullet point?
That's correct. Some of it is enrollment over time, and some of it is just share of local revenue over time. So as local revenue has increased, their overall allocation has increased as well.
Okay.
Yes, so I did have a couple just clarifying questions. Can you remind me, I noticed you said that the state benefits have gone up. The benefits have gone up. What percentage of that does the state pay versus what we own for benefits?
I have to look into that because I'm not sure that the state does have a
They don't have
share.
any share.
So what we get back from the QBE allotments?
Yes, that's what I
Okay,
was- yeah.
so it just depends on the employees that are qualified. So we do have certain certified employees that we receive some state funding for both their salary and their benefit cost. But we don't receive it for all of our employees. Our classified employees are almost 100% funded from APS. And then also, we know that the salary is only a portion of what we pay. So, and also then local fair share takes away about 50% of that allocation as well. So while the state does cover some of it, local is still on the hook for quite a bit of those benefit costs.
Thank you for that. My next question was around the staffing ratios on slide 5. And so is this including district level staff, or is this classroom? And so I know last year we
It's all of
started
it, and
the
we'll dive
conversation
into each
about,
one
like,
of these
the class
bullets.
size. Okay.
Yeah, we'll dive into each one of these bullets.
Okay. And then also, I know we made a significant investment in nutrition. Are we anticipating making the investments at that same amount, or do we anticipate ever seeing cost savings over time, or kind of what's the status of that investment?
Yeah, so I think, We'll have to see how this year goes. We did, I think, set aside about 13 to 15 million from the general fund for a transfer to the nutrition fund. The way we've set that down is for quarterly drawdowns. So as nutrition needs access to those, we would assess that and then transfer. And so we'll see how this year goes and see how much of that we actually need to forward fund the nutrition fund. It can't run a deficit. I hope, the goal is over time we become less dependent on it. I know that our Chief Operations Officer, Larry Hoskin, presented at that same April Board Budget Commission meeting that there's likely always going to need to be some contribution from the general fund as we have currently designed the nutrition program.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to deep dive into some of these drivers, these cost drivers in the form of decision points for FY 2026. So these are 5 areas of focus that our Budget Commission meetings will walk us through and help us to make some decisions on each of these primary cost drivers for the FY 26 budget. So the first thing we're going to talk about is refining our assumptions, some of those assumptions that are going into the multi-year that is creating some of that gap. The refining the assumptions practice will also help us as we're developing our budget parameters for FY 26. The revenue decisions, we'll talk through what's behind that. Our school allocations and how we fund our schools, right-sizing not only our number of schools, but the number of staff within our schools and the budget allocations for our schools, and then a central office review. So those will be the 5 primary decision points that we'll walk through. When we talk about refining our assumptions, we can go ahead and set some guidance around compensation. We know that we were very aggressive in compensation for FY 2025, and we've really positioned ourselves strongly in the market. And so what we have to make some decisions about is, are we going to retain that? We're going to wait and do a market analysis and always try to stay a step ahead. Or in some of our assumptions, are we going to say we're going to back off a little bit in this upcoming year to try to come off of this budget gap? But some of those assumptions sooner rather than later, so what I'm saying is not waiting necessarily till February or March to have the conversations around compensation, can help define now how big of a gap we're trying to close in the out years. So there, some conversation in our budget parameter setting around our goals for compensation would help this. Also around just the level of services. So we include that scaling cost of inflationary cost of doing business for our non-personnel line items. And so we can say, and that maintains services at current levels, or we can say we are willing to take a service offset and keep budgets flat to the previous year for some of our central offices. And those assumptions can help close that gap as well. We do need to have some conversations around redefining and defining equity and resource allocation as it is compared with our autonomy and flexibility conversations. Because the way that we are currently building our budgets using SSF, we'll talk about this again when we talk about our school allotments, does allow for a lot of flexibility in how our schools can use their allocations. And that also means that every school looks different, which can generate a lot of conversations around equity and inequity. And so what we have seen over the last few years is a response to conversations or perceptions of inequity by forward funding more into schools that don't have that program. So we're kind of chasing some allocations. We're not letting schools just look different. So we need to come back to what is the comfort level around that? How comfortable are we with our schools looking very different from each other? Or do we want more standards of service and more alignment? We'll talk about that more when we get to our school allotment formulas. And that the centralized versus decentralized is in the same vein. So where are we going to potentially re-centralize some decision-making authority to gain back some economies of scale in contracting and procurement? Where can we offer certain menus of options so that we can get leaner and standardization of allotments? The second big decision points we'll have is around revenue. So House Bill 581 is the legislation that was passed in this last cycle that would cap the homestead our home values at no more than the CPI, or the inflationary index, as determined on an annual basis. And so basically, if your values go up by 9%, your property values go up by 9%, but inflation was 2%, then you are exempted the 7% between the inflationary values and your actual home values. The district will have an opportunity to opt out of that, or to, if we don't opt out, we will automatically receive that cap. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's in that. I think the district, we have not had a good TAD review, or tax allocation district review, in quite a few years. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to fold into this process as a review of how we participate in the TADs, where our money is going. It's about 16% of our local revenue is in the TADs today. And just kind of reviewing when those sunset and trying to make some decisions around that. And then our legislative priorities, as we're beginning that process, looking at how we can lean into commercial properties and making sure we are getting the full value of the commercial values back into the district. A little bit more on House Bill 581. As I mentioned, the 2024 assessed value would be the capped value going forward, and then all increases would be capped at the inflationary rate for the year. We can opt out. It has to go to referendum in November, and so the process between November and January, we would really need to be, if it passes, which I anticipate that it will, we will need to make some decisions around whether or not APS opts out of that, or we allow it to stay for us by January 1st when it goes into effect, and we have until March to opt out. The potential impact on the first year would be about $45 million, and again, that scales every year. The opt-out, again, by March 1st, we would have to, if we don't, for that opt-out process, it would look very much like our public hearings. So we would have to hold the 3 public hearings, like our millage rate, advertise and post on websites. We would have to adopt a board resolution and file that resolution with the Georgia Secretary of State sometime in between January and March. So very aggressive timeline, which is why we want to have conversations about this really into November. Some unknowns about House Bill 581 is how these exemptions stack against already current exemptions. So if I have a senior exemption of $75,000, is this on top of my $75,000 exemption? So my home would likely be fully, or we just don't have a lot of questions around that. And then how it affects the local fair share. So since this is a statewide referendum, it could be that it doesn't affect our QBE allocations, as opposed to if we opted out and then tried to do our own homestead exemption, it would impact our local fair share, which means we take the double hit from the state as well. So we're trying to get some answers around that as well.
If it's okay, I'm going to pause for 1
Yep.
second, just ask questions about these items. And I know my colleagues have some too. These are some big things, like on slide 8, clearly a lot of questions here, but TAD review and the commercial property review. Realistically, timeline for a TAD review, when do you think we'd have more information around potential opportunities there?
Yeah, so the TAD review, that wouldn't be for any decision-making for this upcoming year. We have a lot of new board members that maybe aren't even aware of the TAD or the omnibus agreement that we've negotiated, I think, in 2019. Does that sound right? Around our TADs and what the district is already getting in pilots, what that timeline is for those being sunset. I just know that as they get closer to sunset, we might be having more conversations about how to extend, how to keep those things going. And I think the board and APS needs to be really aware about the implications of the TADs. So it'd be more of an education for the board and just reminding us what we already have in our commitments to the TADs and when those should sunset, as opposed to renegotiating or trying to change anything around our already settled IGA.
And that's helpful for everyone to understand, I think, that it's more of educational
Yep.
and planning for the future. And then the commercial property review, I mean, that's something. we're
Yeah,
looking
I
at.
think
The city-
that's really just in your legislative priorities. So as the board is setting their legislative priorities, I would advise that we really look at how we can hold commercial properties a little bit more accountable.
Absolutely. And then going back to 581, that's the one that could have the most impact for us.
That's correct.
So just making that really clear. All right, thank you.
So when you said the impact on the, basically the tax situation, you said it would, the impact would be 45 million down, you're anticipating? Okay.
45 million less in what we could have collected. So it's not less money, right? We've been tracking 8 to 10% increases in values for local in the last 3 or 4 years. It would cap that at 2%. So we would still see a 2%, 2 to 3%. Inflationary rates right now are closer to 2%. So if we capped it at that, it's the uncollected potential revenue that we would have counted on had HB 581 not been implemented.
So then our assumptions on that multi-year chart for revenue would decrease, but our expenditures would stay the same, so that gap.
Yeah, that's
would-
what's
would
that's
increase.
what's helping to drive the gap, is our costs continue to increase at a rate that is much higher than the nationwide inflationary rate at the
And that is
moment.
assuming that we continue spending how we're currently
That's correct.
spending. That doesn't, include any changes. All right.
In the last year, our budget increased by 15%. And so the multi-year has us growing at 6%. So it's not just growing at the same rate. Even in the multi-year, we're building in a more conservative growth than we've had in the last 2 to 3 years, which means less, primarily in compensation, which is where our money's been mostly going towards in the last couple budget cycles.
So this is a status quo look. I just need to make sure that all things staying the same, this is where we are. But clearly that can't be the case, so.
This is a conservative status quo look. If
Reality check.
if we spend at the current pace, that would be closer to 150, 170 million dollars. But
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. We can keep moving.
okay, so next is our school allotments. So this is the one we've already kind of teed up with our principals. We're starting to have conversations here around how our schools receive their allocations. This matters quite a bit because we are looking at SSF, our Student Success Funding Formula, our per pupil allocation funding formula, against a more traditional review of allocations. And we need to be able to determine where the decision-making authority lies with schools as we are moving into this process, especially as we start to shift the conversation from if schools had more money, how would they spend it, to if schools had to cut money, where would they cut, right? So it's a different conversation than we've had in the last few years as we've been continuing to drive more and more dollars to schools. And so we have to have a conversation about our comfort level in seeing potential perceptions of inequities as schools try to balance budgets by cutting programs, allocations, raising class sizes, cutting wraparound supports in a way that looks different at every school versus a more standardized approach from the central office saying, you know, this is a program we want to reduce, or this is how we're going to see these cost managed a little bit tighter at the school levels. And so there's a philosophical conversation in this around how comfortable we are in seeing our schools look very different from each other, or cutting programs that other schools might be able to maintain just because of their school allotments. We will also need to take a program review. There's quite a few programs we haven't looked at in quite a few years. And as we always talk about around spend and soft G is spend versus outcomes. Where can we show that our spend has been effective in the past? And where do we have opportunity around our charter allotments to get more streamlined, if at all? And so just to kind of tee up this conversation, we have the per pupil spend by school, by cluster. We've highlighted, so these are all ranked from highest spend to lowest spend within each cluster on a per pupil basis. And we also have the 10-day or the 15th day enrollment counts. We highlighted all of the schools that have less than 300 students in enrollment. So you can see that by and large, the highest per pupil is driven by the lowest enrollment. So that's just the economies of scale that we speak of. And even at our very lowest per pupil schools, I'm just going to highlight this slide and kind of flag it because we'll come back to these numbers at some point. Even at like Jackson High School on this slide, which is the very lowest per pupil at $12,450 at the school. So this has none of our central office administrative cost in it. This is just at the school, is higher than other per pupils at other districts, even the highest other districts. So our schools are very well funded, and I just want to put emphasis on that as we're moving through these slides. Here's another set of clusters. And then this one I would call out, especially for our non-traditional schools and programs. Some of these costs are actually double funded. So like at Phoenix, at ACCA, even with some of our virtual offerings, the programs don't receive state funding, so we're not receiving revenue for these programs. The cost for the student is actually sitting in their home school. So they're receiving the per pupil, sometimes $12,000, $14,000, $15,000 in their home school, and we are funding the program. So there's kind of a triple investment when we talk about some of these programs, and we just want to be realistic about that when we're thinking about, and then what do we get from those for our students?
If it's okay, I'm going to pause for a second.
Yep.
Jessica, you had a question?
Yes. So going back to slide 12, where you were kind of talking about the allotments, the SSF formula, and the allotments, and maybe some schools looking different. So as we're thinking about that, I am curious about how we are capturing, or if there is an appetite to capture the additional sources of funds that some schools receive, because I think that kind of exacerbates how schools look differently, whether it's from grants that they secure for special projects or from foundations that they've set up and have some really robust parent fundraising. And so how are we at least getting an idea of what some of those external funding sources look like across our schools?
Yeah, we could incorporate that as maybe another column off to the side. I will tell you from my experience here, it's not a huge driver. We would be surprised. Probably before SSF, before we started making $42 million of investments around poverty through our SSF allocation, and when we pushed our Title I dollars into our schools and consolidated those funds. If you also, and actually this is a really great slide to demonstrate this. The purpose of this slide is actually to show how, and to try to untangle equity from the SSF versus traditional allotment formulas, because we could allocate through a more traditional allocation formula and still maintain some of the equity gains that we got when we moved to SSF, which was really driving more dollars to our schools that had the greatest need. So this is just kind of modeling out move back towards a more traditional funding formula for our schools and still maintaining roughly that same slope of equity that we've talked about before in these slides. So on this slide, across the bottom of the graph, you'll see a challenge index. That's not the challenge index. That's our number of students who are directly certified for federal assistance, percentage of students across the bottom. So we're using that as a proxy for need, but it is a direct alignment to our poverty allocations and the poverty weights that are driven out through SSF. And across the vertical index, you can see the per pupil spend. So we are by far spending more money on a per pupil basis in our schools that have the greatest need. Now, to your point, this might not be as aggressive of a tilt. It might be a little bit more horizontal if we also included some of the foundation and PTA and booster club fees that we have in there. But also if we start adding in grants and things like that, that kind of goes more to this side. And so, you know, we could look at a full cost out, like looking at all of their funding sources, but it's not going to be a major tilting of this. We tried to correct for a lot of that when we moved to SSF.
Aretta?
And does that include the cash funds that schools get for basically parking and whatnot at like your Chastains and
Yeah, so
Piedmont?
this wouldn't, but
That
what,
would not, but
if we did
a-
an all-inclusive cost out, then we would look at what they've got in their SABO and grants and any other programming.
So
that's coming through.
ultimately, the line would still slope the same way.
It would look very
just would
similar.
not be as steep of a slope as what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And one thing, like, also looking at the different sizes of our schools, and then the percentage to qualify for Title I. Like Sutton is a large school with a large percentage of kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch, but they're not a Title I school based on the percentage and the size. So knowing that, for instance, they do raise a lot of money to support needs, but you're looking at the amount, I'm not looking at it right here, but they get about 11,000 per pupil. So going back to the work you all are doing right now and really unpacking all of this, you know, and I'm jumping ahead with this question, which I don't expect to be answered now, but setting the tone for like, what are we getting for the amount of money we're spending per pupil? And really looking at that in a very laser-focused way, and taking us away from, it's just a matter of the amount of money. That we know that money is extremely important, but really evaluating that. Because, thank you for laying all this out, because I think there is sometimes just not full understanding. And that's the work we have to do. But I think it's important to include, like Aretta's asking, you know, what other pots are out there and how we even support making sure there's connection.
Yep.
So just adding on to that.
Can I jump on that a little bit more? And I think so I was kind of toying with that also, and I don't know if it's just my mathematical mind that wants to see this comparison, but it's kind of I think you were kind of going there, at least I heard it in terms of the results, right? So what are you getting for the spend? And so, and if that ratio is such, then that possibly could require more direction, right? Like basically you earn your autonomy. Is that a fair thought, right? So yeah, you can, if you prove to me that you can get the outcomes that we desire, then continue with your autonomy. If it's looking like we're not getting there, then you might need a little bit more direction, and then we could pull off as the results come.
Yeah.
And that's a logical, just straight logic thinking, not an education, so not trying to create any stressors, but that just kind of logically seems like a place that we could go.
So these are the questions we're asking.
Yeah.
When we get to that point, Dr. Johnson, but we'll let him.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. I think just generally speaking, you're 100% right in regards to what you think about with support of and for schools, and regardless of what the budgetary outlook is, you know, as schools continue to show that they are obtaining and attaining outcomes, you get increased flexibility. I mean, that's just what we're used to, and I think it's the same. We should be having the same conversation around budget, because I think it's fair to look at the investment in places and say, okay, the outcomes don't necessarily align to what the investment right now is, and that could be programmatically, that could be, you know, just the general base funding structure for a school, and so, look, let me back up, because I think the system structures and processes matter, and a part of schools and teaching and learning's work is, as we get cluster superintendents seated, is for those folks to work closely with principals to help them scrutinize their budget and to ensure that whether, and I know the GO teams are involved, I know you've got, you know, this all these pieces that are a part of the budgeting process, but really helping them think through where we're applying those dollars. Is it going to have the biggest impact on student achievement, right? And if it's not going to have an impact on student achievement, then why are we doing it? Like, it's really that black and white when it comes to that part of the conversation. You know, I know Lisa's moving us forward to signature programs because it's probably a great tee up for it. But you know, the question that I have new coming in is as we look at some of the investments that we're making in not just signature programs, but programs across the board. Where do we see, what are we doing to really understand what the impact or what the result of the program or the investment really is, right? Like, we've got millions of dollars invested in turnaround. We've got millions of dollars invested in, you know, in signature programming. And so, you know, these are all areas that I think we've got to scrutinize with more than $100 million gap. If we're going to continue to move forward.
Yep, so we teed it up. So the other place we would want to look is in our programs. Some of the programs that have been around for really almost a decade now, that we have not done that review of effectiveness necessarily for how those dollars are specifically meeting any effectiveness measures or goals that were designed for those. In many cases, those effectiveness measures weren't even put in place when we allocated those dollars. And even for things like our cluster and flex funds, I'm not even sure that schools even realize they still have those, that it was just kind of a legacy allocation baked into the base allotment in 2016. And it felt really exciting then, but now it's just, we just tend to build our budgets the way we have the previous year, and so I'm not even sure if we know that that flexibility is there and being targeted for a specific outcome. Within the program review itself, we have about $63.7 million that we could be critical about thinking about. The right sizing conversation is, I think, already teed up, is around a few different options. One is just those student to staff ratios. This is huge. I can't overstate just the cost and the number of staff that we have. The school sizes, which we've teed up a little bit already in our per pupil review, and then a portfolio review with our charters and our partners. Staff to student ratio comparison, we saw these in April. Actually, with FY25, it's gotten even larger, or the gap between us and other metro districts. For this one, we've just pulled their FY 2025, 24, or 23, if that's the most fresh information we had, for their enrollment, their total staffing. So this is inclusive of any nutrition funded, SPLOST funded, federal funded positions. So this is total position counts. And we've gotten a student to staff ratio and then compared that to other districts. So this is just staff to students. However, we know that our total enrollment also includes quite a few charter and partner students for whom the staff is accounted for in those organizations. So the staff aren't even accounted for in our staff. So for this second slide on slide 20, what we've done is developed a charter proxy to try to back out the number of staff and enrollment from other schools and other districts that might have charter schools. And when we do that, we see that our staff to student ratio is really almost half the leanest district, and is between 2,300 and 3,100 additional staff as compared to other districts. When we think about the base average salary plus all of the benefits for our teachers, it's over $100,000 now. So 100,000 times those 2,300, we are talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars that we're paying a premium for in staff. So again, this is one of those value conversations that we have to have if we truly believe that having more adults helps students achieve, whether that be in classes, whether that be in wraparound supports, whether that be in just however we decide to use those staff members, then we can say we want to keep these low ratios, but we will have to come off of compensation to do it. We cannot continue to stay as competitive as we are and continue to pay as many people as we do. There's got to be some pivot point between those two in the conversation. Another driver for all of those staff, it does include all of the programs and all of the additional allocations that we have for our schools, but a primary driver is the number of schools that we have. And so when you look at the number of schools that we have as compared to our comparison districts, our average school size is about 569 per school, and that compares to about 695 to over 1,200 for other metro districts. If we had the comparable school size as those other districts, we would have between 16 and 49 fewer schools. And I will just add that this only counts for school codes. So I talked before about our programs, dual campuses, ninth grade academies, facilities like our central office facilities or overhead and administrative offices. None of those are even accounted for in this. This is just our traditional school codes. And so that again is a significant cost driver. When we talk about the portfolio, this is what you were mentioning earlier, Board Member Baldwin, how our district has shifted enrollment from our traditional schools to charter and partners over the last decade is a big driver for this allocation. So since 2015, the district enrollment overall has declined by about 1,600 students. Charter enrollment is actually up by about 53%. Some of that is that we did add additional charters or they were continuing to grow out their enrollment over that time period. And then our partner schools, of course, shifted from traditional schools starting in 2017 into 2018. And so we have more of our allocation going there as well. So as we are thinking about how, and this helps inform our central office conversation that we're about to have, but we have not necessarily scaled any of our services based on the shift of enrollment from our district offices to our charter and partner schools. That brings any questions on any of the right sizing conversation.
I guess maybe just for personal knowledge, so you mentioned, I guess, the growth in the charter schools, and we talked earlier about charter school allotment. What are the options around, like I heard you say that it's a share of our overall revenue. What are the options that exist in that space for us?
Mm-hmm. It's limited. So we do have to use the state funding formula to allocate for our charters. This is very specific allocation that's based and derived off of the state QBE and how the charters earn QBE dollars, and then a proportionate share of all of our local dollars. So it's kind of simple math, and there's not a lot of wiggle room in it. Where we do have some options that we've started kind of teeing up is administrative holdback, or where we can do set-asides. Currently, our district does a transfer, an interfund transfer for some of that. We've talked about potentially bringing all of that back into general fund and just doing some shifting there. But it's going to be marginal. There's very little. We're talking about percentage or less of additional that we could recoup in looking at that.
Thank you.
All righty, finally, the fifth decision point is around our central office review. Some of the support model assumptions, so what we would require of our central office, what our goals are as a central office to support schools. Our current year approach being FY 2025, what we're doing right now, and then of course the multi-year around the ERP. Comparison of spend, so of course APS has the highest per pupil allocation. I've already mentioned this as compared to other districts. Our total per pupil allocation is around $19,700. Again, this is just general fund. This is not even including all of our nutrition SPLOST federal programs. So for general fund, it's about $19,000 as compared to between $11,700 and $15,900 for other comparison districts. On a per pupil basis, that's about $189 million to $400 million. that we have in addition to those districts. However, how it breaks out is not out of alignment. So our overall percentage of spend across the different functions is very comparable to the other districts. So it's not that we are over in business administration or general administration as compared to other districts. We are proportionate. And that's because our central office spend is not necessarily based on the number of students we serve. It's the number of staff that we serve and the number of buildings that we serve. And so when we think about like the cost of running a payroll, that's the number of staff that we have, not the students. When we talk about our facilities costs, that's the number of buildings we have, not our students. And so we're running a district that has staff and building numbers that are very comparable to some of these other districts, even though our student population doesn't necessarily support that. But what we can see, even though we are proportionate, is that has varied over the past fiscal years. And so over the last 10 years, growth in the schools has been about 5.43% as compared to about 4.63% in the central office. But the central office as a percentage of the overall budget has varied. So it was at its lowest at 18% in FY21. It was at its highest in FY17 at 28%. And what we can see is years where we've had large cuts in the central office and years where we've had large increases and rebounding in the central office. But overall, what we are seeing is an increase of about 4.63% in central office spending. Even as you recall, enrollment is decreasing at the number of schools that we're serving. And so it is not a proportionate growth for the number of students we're serving because we're still maintaining the number of sites and staff. So in order to make really large decreases in the central office without feeling impacts to the service models that we've set up, we need to scale our number of students and our number of staff and sites accordingly.
Before we leave this slide,
Yep.
that comparison and the growth of central office, how does that compare to student outcomes during that time? I mean, I understand how it's been connected to our structure, and that's what we're talking about, and we'll be talking about more, but that's what I would like to understand. Like if central office is growing and you're explaining that that's been based on the needs of our students, which is extremely important, we need to be able to correlate that with increases in student outcomes. And
Yeah.
if not, we need to be shifting.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm not saying go dig and give a number for each, year, but that's the question that comes to my mind.
It's curious. It's a good question. I would be curious about the same thing even with the school allotments. So in a year that we cut school allotments by 0.59% and another year when we grew it by 17%, did we actually see any variance in student outcomes? Because that would, I think that will show that dollars aren't necessarily driving student outcomes up or down. There's something else behind it.
And that's exactly what we need to understand, what
Yeah.
is behind
Yeah.
increasing student outcomes for our students and our system. Because I do appreciate the comparison to other systems, but we're not them. And because we are smaller, we should have more flexibility, going back to some of the things Aretta was bringing up around, earned autonomy, which we have autonomy, but I don't know if it's not earned. But yeah, like opportunities, but really understanding what has been the history. Clearly, we're looking towards the future, but you do know for sure what has happened.
Mhm.
So thank you for the slide.
Yep. Okay. So this is our moment of hope and optimism and because I'm not going to leave us hanging. So we are we are starting with a significant budget gap. That's not unique for APS. We always tend to start with a pretty big gap, but we can balance it. This slide takes into consideration a piece of everything we've talked about so far. So this does include a couple of school closures. It does include some scaling back of programs. It includes a scaling back of compensation assumptions. It comes off a little bit of everything. And with that, we see about a flat budget going into next year. So if we can just hold tight going into next year, which means cuts to offset necessary increases, we will see compensation increases, we will see benefit increases. So we would need to cut to offset increases. Then we can balance going into next year. FY27, we see that additional revenue come in it's not additional revenue, we see the lack of expenditures for our unpaid pension. In FY27 and FY29, I think we see a tad close. So we see some opportunities on the horizon if we just make some of those really hard decisions going into this FY26 year. Going into FY26, we would tap fund balance one more time. That would take us down to about 12%. And again, this is just if Lisa had to go balance this thing today, this is what I would do. And then by FY27, we would be able to start restoring that fund balance. And by 2028, we would be back above our 15% benchmark and ready to start making some exciting new fund decisions again. But I'm encouraging us to do the hard work for FY26 so we can be positioned for that in the out years.
So thank you for showing me the light, even though I don't see the details behind the light.
I don't want to lead the witness.
But I also, I appreciate you having just giving us this forward picture, right? So it's not just gloom and doom and what's going on right now, but we've got a plan for what's going on. And of course, I know Dr. J is going to say opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. Speaking of opportunity, where in this, or is there a space where we look at, they're not programs, but there's things that we have improved over the years that say we improve spending up to $3 million, or we approve of spending up to such and such, like around Apple products or other different things. Will there also be a space where I guess each department reviews those types of things and looks to see, okay, looking at the trend of spending of where we are, this really was a pie in the sky ask, and realistically, this is where it's going to be. So basically, a tightening of the belts within spaces that have already really been approved, but a relook to see, really kind of like zero base. Like we're not
For sure, yeah.
We're not starting from here we are where we're going to cut, but let's build what we need based on what we got.
Yeah. So I will say all of our contracts are contingent on annual budget authority. So even when we approve a contract that has the option to renew for 3, 4, 5 years, it's always contingent upon the budget authority in that fiscal year. You adopt a budget on an annual basis. And so if we don't have funding for that contract, we won't have that for the upcoming fiscal year. And so that'll be a part of our central office request. And that goes back to the work we're doing in the current year. We're already doing staffing freezes in our central office. We're already doing travel freezes in our central office. Not making any friends around any additional contracts or costs that are arising in the upcoming year. I'm sending everybody back and saying, well, what are you not going to do in order to fund that in your own budgets this year? So we're getting very tight and starting to shift that mindset in FY25. So as we're building those FY26 budgets, we'll already be ready to get a lot leaner in some of those areas.
So for the assumptions around closings, like if we have those would not be immediate because there would be a period of time. It wouldn't just be you're closed. It would be a transition situation type of thing. So is that reflected in the dollars as well?
So I think that anything around school closures, going to be parallel to the budget process, but wouldn't necessarily be embedded in the budget process. So I think we'll start talking about facilities master planning at the October board meeting. At that point in time, we'll be talking about the process, whether there's any changes to the process as it's been in the past. And so that needs to be a consideration that could either support, or we need could support this budget gap closing conversation or not. But that, I think it runs parallel to what's in this conversation.
Okay, and I appreciate you, Dr. Johnson, honestly keeping the community informed in all of these conversations that we're going out. So should not be a surprise to anyone, and I just want to make sure that we're very clear in our communications about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and just being clear with the community. Thank you.
I was just going to say that our commitment is to continue to do that, in particular around the budget, all of it, but in particular right now, having the conversation of awareness around our budget deficit, and that we're having to lean in and make some difficult decisions. And I want to be really clear, because I don't want it to be misconstrued. We will start making those tough decisions here. It will happen right here first. And so we'll lean all the way in here. And that's that's just the truth. And so as a teacher, principal, as a parent, we want to do all we can to preserve the schoolhouse as much as possible. The reality is, I know I've messaged a ton about the $100 million gap as we look at FY26. I think the scarier part is the $250 million gap if you look
2030.
towards FY 2030. And so we've got an opportunity to really self-correct and get some things in line, and that's what we're excited about. Excited is not telling the truth, but that's what we have the opportunity to lean into right now, and so that's what we've got to do.
And that's extremely helpful. And I know you mentioned some things we're looking at right now. Is there anything else that we can talk about that we're looking at in terms of just low-hanging fruit? Like, to remind the
Yeah.
community, we're starting there before we get
Yeah.
to these bigger conversations.
Yeah, so I've been here, I don't know, 40-something school days,
Few
maybe.
years by now, right?
And so I wasn't fully aware there was a $100 million gap, but Lisa told me that pretty quickly after I got here. So, again, the good news is we have a robust resource pool to work with, in particular for our number of students. We do have a lot of schools that we operate, and we understand that. So, when I talk about low-hanging fruit, I mean, we'll start here with things such as, central office travel. We've already implemented a process for review of any roles that are managers and up, and making those hiring leaders really come through a process. Because what we don't want to do, and again, I'm just going to tell what it is, like what we don't want to do is have people come in and be hired, and then in 6 months we're having to, because people are in a job, we're able to recruit talent, which is a really good thing. So we're attacking what we can from a 45-ish day in standpoint, and then we'll continue to lean in as we go over the course of the next several months and have more opportunity to engage the community. We've had a more than initial conversation with school leaders with a very, very similar slide deck presentation on where we are, because it's important for them to understand from their individual communities. And again, right now, knowledge is king, and so we want people to really understand what we're up against. And we need to look at every single thing. And there's an audit of our charter schools that is ongoing. We know we have a significant investment that goes to our charter and partner schools. And again, the focus is on outcomes. And we're pro strong schools with strong outcomes. And so we'll look and lean in there as well. So we have to do that work across the organization, but we're already attacking some areas that we know are there, and we'll continue to do that. I personally, I've asked, I probably got a little too far ahead of myself, but I asked Lisa to cut the travel for the superintendent office in half. I don't go anywhere anyway, and but what was budgeted, right? Now the caveat is it's travel and dues, so we're trying to make sure that we've got all the dues covered that are generally there. So we'll start with 130 Trinity, and then but the truth is when you look at the and I don't want to say enormity to create, but when you look at the enormity of the deficit, we won't be able to capture it all, and so it will have broader implications. And really, if I can say this, this is really a conversation about getting healthy as an organization. Right now, it's there are some unhealthy areas, and we have an opportunity to really get healthy. And so it's an exercise on health, which a healthy organization means that children are going to ultimately be positioned for more success, and that's what we're committed to.
Thank you so much for that. And not about us just being lean. No, it's about being healthy, which is really making sure students have what they need to be successful. And thank you for setting, the tone and leading by example. And we have a role in that too as board members. So I'll also put a plug for your 100-day tracker, which I went and checked out last night to make sure I'm up to date. So folks out there, Dr. Johnson has a 100-day tracker. He's not just sitting here figuring this out. He is out. And I think you visited 300 schools now?
Oh, no, we've got, not 300. We don't have 300.
300, not 300. When I say 300, 300 classrooms.
Oh, yeah.
That's
I was
what
like,
I meant.
oh, no.
I'm sorry. I
we
said
got-
schools.
You put
Speaking
a
of
bunch more schools.
restructuring, excuse me,
So, yeah.
300 classrooms, 300.
I was like, goodness gracious, that was a test.
You were
No.
paying attention.
I'm paying attention. I woke up then. But no, we've been to every traditional school except for I believe I have Ava to go to and maybe adult ed, and so those are the only two traditional campuses that are left. I'm giving principals a public warning. I will start probably the next 3 weeks making the second round of traditional campus visits. Those will be day of announcements, and so there won't be a lot of. But it's not to. There are no I gotchas. It's just I love being in schools, and so that's where the work really happens. And I get so much information in schools, and so it's a really good thing. So we'll continue to do that. I think the midpoint is maybe next week or week after. So we'll give a little more of an update as we get closer.
Thank you, and apologies for my error. 300 classrooms. There's 300 on there, though. It is classrooms. We don't have 300 schools. But yeah, people go check it out because it's by category too, and that helps inform this work.
Alrighty, so that tees us up for the work that we will begin next month, which is setting the budget parameters that will guide us through the FY26 budget development process. The guidelines, the way we've used parameters in the past is it does set some targets around revenue assumptions, fund balance assumptions, some expenditure goals, where you want to see us focusing on budget allocations for the upcoming year, and even maybe some guidance around reductions. Resource parameters, so these are pretty stable, but this is around the revenue allocations. It's again just a commitment to look at all of our funding streams as we're building the budget, not general fund in isolation, but how we're leveraging and optimizing our federal funds, our partnerships, our SPLOST dollars, to make sure that we are maximizing all of the funding opportunities for the district, that we're continuing to take opportunities around grant generating to bringing additional revenue in, that we're seeking the additional philanthropic and community partnership and support as well, and then annually assessing the required millage rate in order to maintain the commitments within the budget. We are committed to maintain a fund balance of between 7.5% and 15%. This year we are at 14.2%. for the FY25 budget. And we will plan to strategically utilize that fund balance or grow fund balance to ensure the operational integrity of the district going forward. These were your expenditure parameters for last year. So what we have typically done on an annual basis is to look at the parameters from the previous year and decide which of those we are going to continue to drive additional supports to. As mentioned, this year we will probably draft out some parameters around those 5 decision points to try to get some additional guidance around assumptions we should be making. So for instance, we have a parameter here that is around competitiveness for compensation. It could be that we reframe that so that there's a competitiveness around compensation while offsetting, but maybe, a step and a COLA, right? And so not necessarily targeting 100% of the metro district or something like that. So it could be, as we shift into school nutrition, we might have a goal around and becoming less dependent on general fund, like a goal or target or guardrail or parameter around some of these in theme with the budget constraints that we see for the upcoming fiscal year. So we'll take our first stab, as we usually do, at building into the budget parameters, and then next month we'll be prepared to unpack those, get feedback on those, and have additional conversation of where we might need to add additional parameters. Also for next month, we will be doing our first really deep dive into the school allotments. So looking at what the school allotment formula does now, what a traditional funding formula would look like, and what we would be able to do with that, the pros and cons of that. We'll have a bit of an exercise around the 2 different schools that have the same budget but look drastically different. We're doing something similar with that with Go Teams. We'll do that with principals as well, just again to spark that philosophical conversation of where we're comfortable. How comfortable are we with our schools looking drastically different? And that can help us to determine how we need to be allocating dollars to schools and if it still makes sense for us to do it in the way that we're doing it. For the Budget Commission, upcoming, I know that we need to reschedule that October 17th one. I think that falls in the middle of a break. So I think we're looking to push that to the next week. I think there was one other on here that had a conflict. The February one was also over a break. So we will tweak this a little bit. Right now, these are just the standing third Thursday meetings, but I really want to focus on the topics, so how these topics will walk us through the budget process. So today, we are hopefully level setting and aligning on some of those budget decision points that we'll need for FY26. In October, the real October one, we'll talk about those draft parameters, the school allotments, and we'll start in a right sizing overview, probably just building off of what you'll see at the board meeting on Monday and how that may or may not inform the budget process for this year. In November, we'll finalize those parameters. We will have gotten past the November referendum, so we'll know if 581 is real for us or not, and have a conversation on revenue for that and try to make a decision there. For the 19th, we have to lock in those school allotments because in January, I'm allocating to the schools. In January, we'll do a deep dive in revenue, and that's also when I'm planning to do that TAD review and education session. February, we'll look at the central office review, a deep dive into the central office allocations. By March, we will be talking about revenue to expenditures gap, so that's when we'll have our full budget together. And we'll know how well we did on that $100 million or if we still have a ways to go. And then in April, we do our special revenue. We'll do our final gap closure conversations to get to a tentative adoption in May. Any changes between tentative and final adoption, you'll see May 15th. And then we'll have our second public hearing and final adoption June 2nd, which is my child's birthday. So just realized that when I said it. So we got a lot to do. We got a plan to do it. It's no different than what we've done every single year. It's just a little bit more aggressive and a little more frank talk than we've had in previous years, but we'll get there.
Absolutely. Well, and another thing, certainly want to include in this timeline for us is the work we'll be doing in going out to the community to reset our goals, the board doing that work to get feedback, and then working with Dr. Johnson based on data to more than likely narrow the focus of our goals, which will help inform decisions around the budget. And of course, the timeline for the development of the strategic plan, or updating it. So this is very helpful in terms of the budget, but knowing that that's happening at the same time.
Yep.
And that is a really critical part of the community's involvement in this process. So you can go back and watch board development today. It was. Talk about opportunity. But it does talk more about the plan to go out to the community. So we will find a way to provide updates on that process during this time in terms of how it aligns with the budget. Jessica?
Katie, I also want to lift up that the board is working to schedule an equity retreat within the same window of time, and I anticipate there will be some learnings out of that session that we will need to add into this conversation.
And 100%, and that's in November, correct?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I won't give an exact date, but just so people know when to, how that will kind of fit in, earlier than later.
And I have one more question for our October meeting. Will you be prepared to discuss, we changed our SSF formula a little bit this year in terms of what that base number was. I would like to have just a look back to see, are we still aligned with that?
Yep.
Did we think that was the right move? How did it impact the schools? I would like a postmortem on that. If
Okay.
that is something that is not going to, if you feel like that's going to be
Yep.
valuable.
No, we'll do just like we do each year, and we'll kind of ground in where we are today. So what the allotment formula is, how that shook out for all of our individual schools, what they've been allotted, and we'll even unpack a little bit how they've used that, those allotments at individual schools. Because I think that helps determine, is it moving back to a traditional, even the shock to the system, we think it might be, because that might not be, I don't know. And then where do we see those outliers, and how comfortable are we with those outliers? So we'll do an unpacking of where we are today that will guide us in a conversation of where we might want it to go tomorrow.
Thank you,
Yep.
because I know there was at least 3, including me, that were just a little bit
Questioning
skeptical about how this was going to impact the schools.
Yep.
And so that would be
We'll show
nice
you.
to have. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I will just point out, this is how we interface with the board on the budget. There's a million things going on behind this schedule, and so we'll be meeting with our Student Advisory Council, principals meetings, our Go Team summits, plugging in with Go Teams. We'll have plenty of opportunities throughout the process to engage and get feedback as well. So while you guys are engaging at your meetings, and we're happy to hop into any of those as well and present if we need to, we'll be also getting feedback from a variety of community in this process as well. All right, that's all I have. Any additional questions or concerns for me?
I think that's it. And yeah, just to reemphasize what Aretta was asking about, just understanding the impact and the feedback we're getting. And because Ken couldn't be here today, but I know his question to me has been like, what are we going to be recommending? What's going to be shifting? He is. It's Rosh Hashanah, so he's not right now, which he should not be. But yeah, strategic abandonment of things that aren't working. And then yes, we all want to make sure that students have what they need to be successful, but what is that? And knowing we're still early in the development process, but looking forward to the meeting, which will be later in October. So we even have more time, thankfully. But yeah, and I'll encourage our colleagues to be present or tune in. But of course, the Budget Commission leads this process, and it's on us to help share out information too. So looking forward to the work and all the opportunities. Dr. Johnson, anything else? Do we have any public comment? And actually, I know we do.
Madam Chair,
You're on
we
the
do.
spot, Marshall.
Marshall Norsing in person.
If you come, you have to speak. We expect it. We expect you to speak.
But, oh man, I can't see the timer, so I'm gonna cause, that's okay. Does this have to be on? Yep, is a race. Okay. So I'm going to say thanks for the presentation. I'm actually going to suggest that it's more dire than Lisa is good at pointing out. And as some of you have mentioned, right, this $100 million, you have 25% of your schools, your students that are immune from that cut. Charters and partners, first allocation based on law, they are not subject to this 100 million cut. It is only traditional and central office. They're also immune from the line that we like to show versus poverty. Completely immune. Do something completely different. They're also immune from this discussion about central control versus school control. So somehow we've decided that 25% are separate. So I'm going to say taking $100 million out of traditional and central office is a big deal. And having done this, been here for a decade, no, it's going to take $150 million worth of ideas, because when you affect the schoolhouse, right, the crowds are going to come and you all are going to roll some of them back. So it's not just $100 million on the dot. There's hopefully a bigger set of ideas. And the last piece I'd say is just longer term, if we can integrate SPLOS and the facilities plan into this. We've never had a SPLOS goal to increase efficiency, to build larger schools, to not do a project if it's in a 250-person school. And I guarantee in the next 6 months, we're going to hear, oh, we can't, are we really going to consolidate X? We just did the HVAC. We just changed the roof. We just did the parking lot as a sunk cost for a reason not to do something, and it hasn't been part of the long-term solution. So, thank you.
We're not supposed to do back and forth, and we're not. But yeah, no, we agree. We
I
need to
will-
connect these pieces.
I-
Dr. Johnson?
I will note, I have to get used to, can I say something after public comment? It used to, my former district, well, okay. It used to be that you can't respond to public comment in my former district. I'm not responding, I'll make a statement. So I'm really excited that in next week's board meeting, the budget conversation, there's a budget presentation in the work session and a facilities presentation in the work session. Because you can't really untangle the two. You can't untangle operation, you know what I mean? You can't untangle the two. And so, we'll get there. You nail on the head on all those things.
Yes, we've all been talking about them, so thank you, Dr. Johnson. All right. Anything else? No further business to discuss? Thank you all so much. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all.